Hi, this is Hannah Lee at Pro Bono Law Ontario at Holland Bloorview. Thank you for coming today. I'm the triage lawyer here at Holland Bloorview. We're presenting today on special education law and human rights. This presentation contains general legal information for people in Ontario. It's not intended to be used as advice. The information is considered to be true and correct at the date of the presentation, November 11th, but changes in circumstances after the time may impact on the accuracy. Today, I'd like to focus on 4 topics. What are the school board's duties under human rights law? What are their duties under special education law, and how do they intersect? What's the relationship? And also, I would like to provide parents and families information so that they can feel fluent and more comfortable in the language of special education. To provide some context, we can say that 1 in 10 students in Ontario receive special education programs and services. Under the law, the duties of the board, this is specific to human rights law, is that all students have a right to equal treatment in the provision of education services without discrimination. So in this case, we would be focusing on different grounds for discrimination and, for example, disability or race. If there is a prima facie case of discrimination, which means at first instance, it's a fancy Latin term for that, just at first instance, a case of discrimination, the education provider has a duty to accommodate to the point of undue hardship. So this means that boards have an obligation to provide what's called meaningful access to education for students who have a disability, and for ensuring that those students can fully access the benefits of the education system. Under human rights law, the question of whether programs and services are appropriate may have to be subject to an application. It's to the Ontario Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario to determine. And there is a 1-year limitation period to make this application. The focus would be on the needs and best interests of the child and not on other factors such as a parent's preferences or wishes. When we say a prima facie case of discrimination, we look at who needs to prove that, and it's the parent who has the onus of proving on what's called the balance of probability. So that means more often than not, so greater than 50%, as opposed to on a balance on a higher standard of proof. This is a balance of probability standard. That they have to prove, number 1, that the student has a disability, and number 2, that as a result, they experienced adverse treatment, which is linked to that. So the real question is, when you're in a situation of determining if it's a human rights issue, is, was the student denied meaningful access to education provided to all students because of his or her disability? And if so, then the education provider has a duty to accommodate that child to the point of undue hardship. So we can see here a picture, and it shows very well this duty to accommodate. The difference I want to highlight is that all these children don't have, in the first picture, we see that treating everybody the same by giving everybody a block does not necessarily mean all children get to see the baseball field, but by rearranging the block, we see that blocks and providing a ramp, we see that in the second picture, all of the children are able to have access to the view of the game. So by treating everybody the same may not be the solution. And the duty to accommodate really is about looking at that person's circumstances and making sure that that person has what they need in order to meaningfully access education, and sometimes that standard is not equal treatment. So when we talk about this accommodation, this duty to accommodate, which is this ramp, and that we saw in the first picture, we have to look at two aspects to that. There is a procedural aspect and a substantive aspect to the duty to accommodate. So the procedural duty that the board would have is really taking time to look at the needs of the individual and what the board can do, right? So it means taking steps to learn about the situation and not just dismissing somebody out of hand. It's concerned with taking adequate steps to explore, take reasonable investigation to understand, and take time to meet with parents and have a real genuine conversation to gather information about the child. So that's the procedural duty. What steps are they taking? This is before the ramp has been given, but the actual process, the discussions, the willingness to enter into discussions that a board should be under law, be willing to initiate and to undertake as part of the initiative. But the substantive duty asks, so that goes really to the meat. What are the modifications, the accommodations, the behavioral strategies, the equipment that are required to the point of undue hardship to allow the student to fully access the education in a meaningful way. So this part of the duty to accommodate is concerned with exploring real legitimate options to provide the accommodations, including the appropriateness of the modifications and programming and all kinds of accommodations to access the curriculum. So when we talk about appropriate in terms of the standard of accommodation, we're looking at supports or services that are not provided to the general student population, but that are required by individual students with special needs to help them achieve learning expectations and demonstrate learning. Okay, so we're talking about individualized treatment here. We're looking at a resource guide that's been published that gives us further insight, as well as the Human Rights Commission that identifies accommodation as a means of preventing and removing barriers that impede students from participating fully in the environment. The most appropriate one is one that respects dignity and responds to individual needs and promotes inclusion and full participation. So these are some principles behind the idea. And it's also important to keep in mind that it's a continuum. It's not an all or nothing proposition. And many times you'll have parents waiting. So then the question is, what is the next best or interim accommodation while the most appropriate accommodation is being phased in or put in place at a later date? It's also important to keep in mind, parental expectations in terms of being appropriate. It's not necessarily the same as the ideal or preferred or wished upon solution. So there's many different but equally appropriate ways to accommodate a student's needs, and it does, just because a school doesn't implement that particular method or choice or solution that's preferred by a parent doesn't necessarily mean there's a failure in a duty to accommodate. So the Human Rights Code doesn't guarantee perfect accommodation or the right to any one particular form of accommodation. And so the question is not whether, this is what was given in terms of what was wanted, but and ideal, but really whether they're appropriate. Denying accommodation request for a service that's outside the school board's legislative mandate does not constitute discrimination. And for example, denying therapeutic service not required to access education, but is needed to for the benefit of children or the youth does not necessarily constitute discrimination. A duty to accommodate to the point of undue hardship. So this there's a limit to the duty of accommodation. And sometimes the board will argue that we have a defense that will relieve us from providing this. And that defense is, well, in order for, if we were to be ordered to provide this accommodation, it would be unduly hard on us. This would be undue hardship. And that's kind of a limitation or a defense that the board would use to say, you know what, in this case, I think you're asking for too much. We can't do this. In other words, the boards, so the counter argument to that would be, if it's difficult and challenging or inconvenient, those aren't necessarily reasons in and of themselves that would prove undue hardship necessarily. There are three considerations that would be relevant in an argument to establish undue hardship. I'm going to just focus on the cost one, because that's the one that I think parents encounter the most, which is the board sort of saying, well, it costs too much, and therefore we shouldn't be ordered to do this. And so the argument, the ability to successfully argue that this is undue hardship in this case by the board is a pretty high standard they'd have to meet. The test is whether the costs would be so substantial that they would alter the essential nature, that would substantially affect the viability of the institution. So like bankruptcy, basically. So it's a pretty high threshold. Education providers can't use this argument of limited resources, a limited budget, or restrictions as a defense to discrimination without having to reach the standard of undue hardship, which is pretty high. And every student with a disability is entitled to accommodation to the point of undue hardship. And the fact that there are other students with disabilities in a class who require a high level of accommodation does not remove that duty. Short of being able to prove that it's in order to provide that, it would cause them undue hardship. So now that's in a nutshell the flavor of human rights, how an argument based on human rights would look like. But it's also important to keep in mind that there is a statute, the Education Act, and regulations, and a lot of sort of policy manuals that flesh out in a statutory prescribed form what a duty to accommodate, or what accommodation, or how special education is really administered. So really, if you want to think about it as special education is a manifestation of a broader obligation under human rights law to accommodate persons with disabilities. So they're not different, they're very much the same, but I would say special education is a little bit, it's really implementing the idea behind what human rights law is. It's a specialized process developed to enable accommodation to occur more efficiently. And just because there isn't a special education process in play, it doesn't necessarily mean that the board is relieved of their obligations, their broader obligations to accommodate under human rights law. So what's the board's duty under the special education law? The law says that under the Education Act and related regulations, the providers, the boards, are responsible for ensuring that all exceptional children in Ontario have access to appropriate special education programs and services without payment of fees. So we're going to look at some of this language. What's an exception? What do we mean by exception? Exceptional, sorry. And what does appropriate mean? So the exception is a really interesting word. It's like a trigger to how the process gets started. So when does the obligation to provide special education arise? And it really has to do with identifying a child as being exceptional. So there's a process in which that is done, but exceptionality falls in 5 categories. So they are behavioral exceptionalities, communication, intellectual exceptionalities, physical exceptionalities, and multiple. So if you have more than one of these categories of exceptionalities, and in order to be identified as being exceptional, you need to go through a process, and that process is called the IPRC process. But What if you haven't gone through that process and haven't yet been identified as being exceptional? Well, boards do still have an obligation to act on information suggesting that students may have an exceptionality, and investigating that possibility, and also providing parents with information about accommodations that are available to these students. This obligation to provide special education under the Education Act isn't limited to kids who've been identified through that IPRC process because of the broader human rights obligations. But I would say this process triggers a special education process, and that's basically the first step. So I talked a little bit about our IPRC, and IPRC stands for Identification, Placement, Review Committee. And basically how you start the process is by asking the principal in writing for a meeting, for an IPRC meeting, because many times parents are stymied and they don't feel like they're getting anywhere with the administration. There is a process, and after that process is triggered through written request, there is a sort of a duty to respond. Now, they have 15 days to provide a guide to the parents explaining how it all works, and to give notice of a meeting within 10 days in advance of that. Sorry, 10 days in advance of the notice of the meeting. So things have to happen after that written notice by the parent is provided. Principals can also initiate an IPRC on their own initiative as well. There's no need for a parent to request that. And parents and students over 16, well, parents can attend, but students over 16, parents have a right to attend, but students over 16 have a right to attend as well. So the committee makes two decisions. They make a decision based on placement and exceptionality. We talked about the exceptionalities, and also placement. So what do we mean by placement? Placement really is the environment in which the education program is delivered. So there's 6 different placements that they can recommend in their decision. And you'll see, ranging from a regular class with indirect support all the way down to special education class full-time. The intensity of intervention in terms of supports are reflected in a continuum of placements. What are the sort of guiding principles in determining the most appropriate placement for the child? Well, the IPRC is guided by certain principles in human rights, such as integration. Integration is not the presumption, it's a norm. We also look at, what is in the best interest of the child, what is in that child's best interest in terms of their individual needs, and how can those needs best be accommodated within the environment. Also a need to consider the child's own views and the parents' views as well in determining where the best environment would be to deliver those services in light of what the child needs. After you receive the meeting, the decision, the meeting, there are steps that a parent can take if they're not happy with the decision, they disagree with perhaps the exceptionality. Maybe they feel like that's not the right category, or perhaps it's missing, or they don't agree with the placement. They can request a follow-up meeting or appeal within a certain, within 30 days. And from that appeal, they can further appeal as well. After the meeting, the decision is made, that decision can be subject to another IPRC meeting after 3 months in the placement. And the decision can't be changed without another meeting. The decision has to be reviewed each year unless the parent waives it. As part of the meeting or the decision, there's going to be a section in which there will be recommendations about supports and accommodations and things that the child would need that would that may, there's no right, but may form the basis of what would be included in the IEP, which stands for Individual Education Plan. So the child has gone through a process, they've been identified as exceptional, and once that identification has been made, now there is a statutory obligation under special education law to be provided with appropriate programs and services. And how that is implemented is through that IEP. The IEP will contain certain learning expectations and an outline of the programs and services that the school and the board have to address them. There are certain things that this IEP document must contain. For example, they would explain how the student's progress would be reviewed, a plan for transitioning, and every time an IEP is issued and updated regularly, it has to be done in consultation. I did have some resources at the very end in terms of where you might want to go for support with special education. And I think you'll all be getting a copy of our slides. And on that, as part of the slides, there is a slide there that outlines where parents may be able to access some legal support in their special education questions. So I'm so sorry, that's very bizarre that it didn't go to the end, but I think I was pretty much near the end of my presentation in terms of indicating the differences between the two. But yes, let me see now. I think, shall I go to the Q&A then?
Yes, that would be great. Thanks, Hannah.
Sure. Okay. Anonymous. Okay. Our 7-year-old is autistic and my 4-year-old has ADHD. They're both homeschooled. We'd like to get them into the public school 3 days a week for a few hours so they have opportunities to socialize. We'd also want their mother to be at the school during that time, as they're both still in diapers and we don't want them to be sent to timeout rooms. We'd prefer they be with their mother if there are problems. We've spoken to the vice principal who's told us that she cannot accommodate us. Right, okay, so grade 2 and senior, it sounds like the 4-year-old sounds like they're in nursery school, I suppose? 4, right? So they're not yet in grade 1 is 6. Homeschool, okay, so right. The question is there the ability for a parent to come to school to accommodate, so that to take care of toileting, I think, or just being able to attend to their personal needs, right? And so I guess here, it sounds like in order for your children, they're going to grade 1 or grade 2, say, to access school in a way that's going to, so that they can stay there and not have to be sort of have their education interrupted or be told to go home because they need help with personal care. This is something that should be provided, like if, for example, they went through that process that I just described, that IPRC process, they would be recognized as somebody who has a medical condition or a disability or an exceptionality that would require, in order for them to access education, these types of supports, having support so that they can be in school and have their needs taken care of at the same time. So that would be part of how they would accommodate them in the school. And I know that you've wanted to come up with your solution of having a parent there and to be that support person for the child. And that's, some parents even ask, can I hire my own support person and have them come, into the school? And the way, the answer is, you can't do that. But, when they're really young like that, some, especially, well, in preschool, more like, it's not unusual for parents to volunteer. But I think if you're asking for to be the person to be all there all the time, that's really something that should be taken care of. The board should be taking care of that for you. You shouldn't have to, be the person, you're working or whatever. They should be providing that ramp so that he can access his education without having to need your support necessarily for personal care. And that would be all taken into account in the context of an IEP, so that there is going to be some protocol or process in place to respond to that. So I think that would be my answer to the first person. Oh, it's 6:01. What should I do now, Mel?
Well, I'm thinking maybe we can go to Allison, and then at the very end, we do have some more Q&A time set out, so then we can finish the rest of the questions there.
Or I can try to, if to the extent I can type an answer too, I can do that.
Yes, you can also do that too. You can type the answer in the Q&A box,
Sure.
and then that would be probably really helpful.
Okay.
Okay, so I am going to pass it over to Allison now. And Allison, are you able to share your screen?
I am. Let's put it up into the slideshow format. So we'll do the slides from the beginning. So thank you very much for coming out today. I see we have 76 people, which is just absolutely great. Really appreciate you taking the time to attend this evening. So Hannah has really dealt with some of the legal framework around special education in Ontario. And I'm going to take a totally different approach. I'm going to be thinking about, as a parent, at the different points in education, what are the things that you can do to advocate for your child? So I've got tips along that. So from starting school, when you have an IPRC, when you have an IEP. But it's all, so most of my slides are sort of lists of tips of things that you can do. And so hopefully when you get a copy of it after this session, it will reinforce when you read it what I'm going to talk about. And I'll probably illustrate it with some anecdotes as we go along. So parent roles in education. So this is for all parents. You need to support the student at home. Doesn't matter whether they have special needs or not. One of your jobs as a parent is to support them at home. Another is to be involved in school activities. Often for a working parent that becomes difficult, but there are open houses and evening events that the school puts on. And so the more you can be involved in those, the more your face becomes familiar to the school, the more you're seen as an engaged parent. And in addition, you need to be communicating regularly with the classroom teacher and address concerns as they arise. So in any dispute resolution process, you really always start at the beginning. Where is it occurring? So if it's in the classroom, the first person you talk to is the classroom teacher. You don't start by going to the principal or the trustee. You start with where the issue is and try to resolve it there. If not, then you go up the chain of command, which would probably lead you to a special education teacher and potentially the principal, and then may go up to a superintendent. But you need to be following the chain of command in terms of raising that concern and trying to get a solution. For those parents who have a child with a disability or who has special education needs, you have additional things. You need to be attending any case conferences or school team meetings, including the IPRC. You need to be providing input into the development and monitoring of the individual education plan. And you need to be as engaged as you can in these processes, recognizing again that as a parent, you may not be able to do everything that you want to do. So this is where you also may need to have a little team around you supporting you in your advocacy efforts. So I'm just going to briefly talk about starting school. I did a transition workshop for the Holland Review earlier this year. And so again, what are the parent roles? So the first is that registering of the child and attending the parent evening at the school and in the community. So those open evenings are for any parent of a child that's in kindergarten and is going to be starting school in September. So this, the registration process is at the school level where you register. And so a parent with a special needs child might say, where? Well, the first place you always start is with your neighborhood school. So if you know where your nearest school is, whether it's French public or Catholic or English public or Catholic, you go to that school and that's where you register. That's your starting point into the system. Once you have registered, there will be questions you answer. And I know a lot of parents struggle with the idea of whether they should disclose their child's needs. I am 100% in favor of sharing information about your child with the school. I've heard parents say, well, I don't want them to be prejudiced against my child. I want them to accept the child in the classroom, and then they can see that there's problems. Well, I think there will be problems if you set it up that way. It is better to be open with the school and talk about your child's needs so that they and you together can do some planning for the successful start of your child at school. So this can mean participating in meetings and case conferences about your child, either just before you start school or once you're in school, there may continue to be meetings. So participating in them and sharing information about your child. Sharing of information is under your control. So if you've got speech language pathology reports, or you've got medical diagnostic information, it is still at your judgment about sharing. But in my mind, the more that the information the school has, the better job they're going to be able to do in terms of supporting your child. The other thing that we often forget about in terms of planning for school is preparing your child. For many children, transitions are difficult, and there's lots of things that you can do to prepare your child for the transition. Things like practicing routines, things that they, if they've only ever been at home, and which is very, very likely given our pandemic, and they haven't sat in circles with other children. They haven't known that they need to be taking turns. So there's lots of activities you can do with your child that's going to practice some of those classroom skills that they're going to need once they start school. The other thing is familiarity with the school itself. Often your neighborhood school has a playground where you could go and visit during the summer, but you can also ask for tours of the school so that you become familiar and your child becomes familiar. So it's really important in transitions not to forget about your child. So one of the things that I always recommend for all parents at the beginning of their journey is that they develop a parent resource binder. So that can be any binder that you buy at the Walmart or a store in the community, and then you can start putting information into it. I know when I've done parent workshops, and I know a lot of other agencies do, they will often help parents develop a binder where they can store the information. So this is where when you register or when you get first information about the class, you can start to put information about the school into your one of your sections in your binder. You can start to organize the reports that you've already got from the preschool providers and put them into the binder. And then as your child goes through the school system, you can start to put copies of school assessments and reports. You can put the report cards in there. And most importantly, any of their special education records, including the IPRC and IEP. So making sure that you've got that information to hand. I always talk to the parents about the binder as a shield. When you have yourself organized, and it looks very, very professional. And so when you go into that meeting with all those professionals, which can be very intimidating, this is your shield. This is your showing that you're working at the same level as the professionals. You've come in prepared with your information at your fingertips. And as the child goes through the school system, it's often vital to know where all these things are. So having a parent resource binder is really important. Finally, in terms of the transition to school, you need to be thinking globally about all the issues that might impact your child. I've worked most closely with children that have physical disabilities as I work at Easter Seals. And so getting to school, transportation is one of the big first questions in terms of how they're going to go to school. Is there going to be a wheelchair access in the bus that will take them? Accessibility within the classroom. So if they're going into a new classroom, is it going to be able to accommodate their wheelchair? Is there going to be enough space in the classroom? What are the accessibility challenges in the school? And often this will come up as a barrier certainly in the urban areas with older schools. They're often multi-level and don't have elevators. And so the child may not have access to the whole building. And this is where some discussions may take place about that there may be another school that might be a better fit for your child. And so those are the discussions that can come from asking these questions. The other piece is equipment use and storage. So if your child's using a wheelchair, but needs to be walking with a walker for part of the day, is there going to be a room and a place to safely store that? And are there going to be any issues with transportation if necessary? One of the things to really highlight for the school is the communication skills. When you look at the kindergarten program, the youngest child can be only 3 years and 8 months. The oldest child starting that same year could be 4 years and 8 months. And so there's a huge developmental range in that, that 1 year. And if it's a combined JK and SK, you've got probably 2.5 to 3 years of difference between the youngest and eldest child. So some of the children that come will have less communication skills than others. Some of them may have already been seen by the preschool speech and language program, and there may be a transition plan for their services. But for other children that haven't been at school, challenges with communication arise pretty quickly, and the teacher will spot it and probably start to have some conversations with you. But if you can prepare them in advance that your child does have challenges, then they're going to be ready to help. You can also talk about what your child will require in terms of personal or health care. The one question in terms of that Hannah was answering in terms of washrooming, we have heard parents being told, your child can't start school, they're still in diapers. That is not, or is never true. There are reasons why children are still in diapers. And so it may be that they're slow in actual toilet training, but it's something that's being undergoing. Or for some children, with a disability, they're never going to be toilet trained. They're never going to have control of their bladder or bowel, and they're always going to require diapers. So it's about talking up front about the fact that your child needs diapers, discussing what needs they'll have at school. Do they wear the same one all day? Will it need to be changed? Are they capable of being involved in the changing, or is it totally where they're dependent and will need a change table to support the activity? And then the other thing is to find out a bit more about the child's daily routines. When we talk about children who are hyperactive, or children that are very withdrawn, or children that have some soothing routines that help them deal with change, it's really good to share those so that the teacher can be prepared and offer those calming techniques when they're needed. I'm just going to throw this one slide in relative to Toronto, because Toronto District School Board is unique in that they have something called the Special Education Program Recommendation Committee. And it is made up of the school principal and in consultation with the school support team. Now, this is a voluntary process, so that you can, they can invite you to a meeting, and then at that meeting, you can start to talk about whether your child needs to go into an intensive special education program right from the start. You can go to those discussions, but your right is always to start in the regular classroom, and it may be that at a later date that they need to go into a special classroom. But if it's clear when they start school that they're going to need a lot of additional support, this discussion at the SEPRC can be very helpful. What I need to be clear about, this is not an IPRC. This is not a meeting where you can be appeal the decision. This is a discussion to sort of talk about whether a special placement might be appropriate, and if so, then they can set it up for September. If the parent doesn't wish to go and wants to go with a regular placement, they don't have to have the meeting. But this process is very unique to the Toronto board, so I just wanted to point it out because I know many of you are from Toronto. As a parent, I've talked at the beginning about the things that you can do to support your child in terms of attending meetings and going to school events. So one of your goals as a parent is building a positive relationship with the school. So we need to remember to share the good news stories. Often a parent is seen as only coming in when there's something going wrong or she's unhappy with what she's heard from her child. So if you've got some good news stories, maybe something that happened in the family or at home, or if they really liked something they did at school and were very excited about it, it's really good to give positive feedback to the teacher. That's part of building your relationship with her or him. And it's also setting the ground for a positive relationship. As I talked earlier, if you have a concern, you need to be talking to the staff involved as soon as possible. You don't want things to escalate. You want to find out if you can get to a solution quickly. The other piece in this is often we get the concern raised by the child, and then they say things. And so it's really important that you verify. So you don't go screaming at the school, my child said this is happening and that's not right. That's not setting you off on a good foot. You might want to say, my child shared this information. I wonder if you can give me some more details about what happened so I can understand better. And it may be, as you ask those questions, that it is clear that there's a concern that needs to be addressed. But often how you present yourself and what information you share can be really vital in terms of setting the relationship and making sure that the focus is on the solution and not the problem. So as I say, making it clear that you want to work with the staff to resolve the issue and being open to different ideas. Often parents at the beginning say, well, I think my child needs to have an EA all the time. Well, that's a big ask of the school system. And at first glance, they might say, well, there's no way we can do that. We only have one EA in the whole school. So what is necessary on your part is to start to break down what are the supports that my child actually needs and what are the ways they can get that support. So it may end up that there's only need for the EA to come in a couple of days for personal, a couple of times a day for personal care. In other cases, they may need to be provided significant supervision when they're at school. So it's all about looking at what the problem is, trying to sort of define it, not saying that this child needs an EA all day. What is it that they actually need? What do they need help with? What kind of supports? It may end up being an EA, but there may be a lot of other solutions that can be found. I know when my daughter with cerebral palsy and a developmental delay was in kindergarten, we ended up having a volunteer that came in several times a week to work with her individually. And that relationship was a really strong and positive impact and was able to help my daughter with different things. So the solution may not always be a paid EA. It could be a grade 6 or a grade 8 student that is coming in every recess to help with dressing or other activities. So there's more than one solution, and you need to be open-minded to really listen to what's being said and share and brainstorm to find a solution or compromise that everyone's happy with. If you can't resolve the issue at the classroom level, that's when you might be taking it up to the principal. But again, it's not going in to complain. What you're going into to do is sort of raise the concern, explain the issue, and then work with the principal on finding a solution. Again, but the more solution focused you are, the more effective you're going to be as an advocate. So what other tips do we have for successful advocacy? One of the first is knowing your child. So you've had your child already at home for 4 years, maybe longer. And in that time, you've had lots of intervention, perhaps from the healthcare system in terms of nursing supports. You may have had preschool speech and language. You may have had other preschool services, including rehabilitation services, physiotherapy or occupational therapy. You may have a lot of reports about your child. So you know a lot about your child before they start school. And so part of this is going to be sharing it with the classroom teacher and the school staff so that they can understand about your child. In most of those reports, there's going to be lists of recommended strategies. So you're already going in with some resources that you can share with the teacher to help support your child. One of the things that I've heard from OTs and PTs is that you can never really predict the outcome for an individual child. A child that has a disability is unique and their trajectory can be very different to what you expected. It could be less, it could be more. So it's at the beginning, you want to be making sure that you're giving them every opportunity. So know your child, go to the meetings, organize your child's records, work with the teacher. Next is knowing your rights and responsibilities. And Hannah's alluded to some of the pieces of legislation that guide special education, particularly around the human rights laws and the duty to accommodate, but also around the special education legislation and the IPRC. What are your rights within those processes? So this workshop is not covering off all those things. It's giving you a taste. But as you longer in the school system, the more you might need to investigate what your rights and responsibilities are in terms of special education. The other piece is advice from university students with disabilities. You need to involve your child. I had a young man who's now in his second year at university say he never really understood his IEP or what it was doing to help him. It wasn't until he was expected as an adult to advocate for himself that he started looking at it and realizing the supports that had been provided to him and that were effective. And now he was going to have to tell the post-secondary institution what things helped him. He wished he'd been more involved as a child, particularly in those teen years when they can start to be attending meetings and participating in the discussions. You want to be able to grow them as an effective self-advocate, and that starts by involving your child from a young age. The other thing is, throughout your child's career, is attending workshops and conferences. I would suspect that some of you are at the early stage of just starting school, but even at the high school level, there's something to be learned all the time about special education, about school programs. The big change that we've seen this year at high school is the de-streaming of mathematics. And I know that there's a lot of concern and angst in the community about what does that mean for students with special education needs that have an IEP. So you need to be going to any sessions they're holding to talk about the de-streaming, what it means in terms of programming, and what types of accommodations they're able to offer students. So attending workshops at the school, conferences on disability is all good ways to build up your knowledge. The next slide is on preparing for a meeting. So there's a variety of meetings that you have to go to, whether it's a case conference or an IPRC. So before that meeting, what do you need to know? So some of the things you need to know are obvious. You need to know the date and location, but really you also need to understand what's the purpose of the meeting. Is this just a general discussion? Is it because there's a particular issue we're trying to address? Or is this our annual review of their exceptionality and placement? So you need to know why you're going to the meeting. The next is who will be attending. I've heard staff say, when I've given a workshop about the parent concerns, they never really thought about it from the parent perspective. When the special education teacher was setting up the meeting, she invited the psychologist, she invited the speech language therapist, she invited the classroom teacher. She was able to get the educational assistant to attend. There was also a teacher, if it was a transition, from the new school. That's very intimidating for a parent to walk in and see 7 or 8 people around the table who've all come for the best interest for your child, but it can be very intimidating. So make sure you know in advance who will be attending. And the fallback position is maybe you shouldn't be attending alone. At any of these meetings, and including at an IPRC, you have the right to have somebody with you. And so it's a good idea to go, if you've got a partner, to take your partner, but another family member or a friend could also go. That person can then help you in multiple ways by being at the meeting and helping you prepare for it. You need to know what information you should take to the meeting, and you need to make a list of the questions you should ask. When I was talking about the transition into kindergarten, I sort of gave you a list of questions to ask about that transition. But whatever the meeting is, you should be thinking about what you need to ask. And then, more importantly, you need to know what will happen next. So when you're going, and they'll say, well, this is the IPRC, and at the end of it, we'll make a decision, and then we'll notify you of the decision, and we'll ask you whether you agree with it. Or it could be just that, well, we're going to try a new strategy in the classroom. We're going to try this for 8 weeks, and then we're going to reevaluate. So having an idea when you go to the meeting, what's going to happen next is really helpful. At the meeting, I encourage everybody to start discussions with student strengths and areas of success. Very quickly, it can digress into the area of what and sound like what's wrong with the child. So really, if you have an opportunity to share some of their school successes or other successes, maybe they're in a sport or an activity in the community where they're very successful. So starting by the student's strength. Another tip I've heard from parents is to ask everybody at the table how they know your child. So personalize it for them, making sure that they are there for your child and really know who they're talking about. You need to be able to listen to the concerns raised by school staff and ask questions to understand the issues. You might, at the meeting, they might determine what additional information may be required. At the meeting, they're going to decide on a plan or future action. Who does what when? Some of the pieces may be actions that you need to take. Perhaps if they felt that there's a problem with his speech, which may be related to hearing, they may be encouraging you to take your child to an audiologist to get their hearing tested. So there may be some things that you have to do, but there may be other players that are all going to do extra work. And it's really important to know who does what when. Again, I've been to meetings where we had a good discussion, we ended up on a feel-good note, we all left, and then I looked back and I thought, who's going to do what when? You need to always come out of the meeting with that action plan. Who does it? When are they going to do it? And when are we going to get together again to review the progress? That is often a missing step. They say they're going to try it for 8 weeks. Well, then we should be reconvening in 8 weeks to see if it's made a difference. So it's very important that you're always thinking about all these elements of the meeting and what's going to happen in the future. Shared Solutions is a guide to resolving conflicts in special education. It's a ministry document that you can find on their website, Shared Solutions, and it has lots of tips on how to resolve issues and concerns at school. One of the pages that I really like is the page on active listening. Often when we go in, we're very tense in the meeting. We're thinking about the things we want to say, and often we're not listening to what's going on or what's being said. So being really in the meeting, attending, listening, and then you want to be able to demonstrate that you're listening, whether that's by maintaining eye contact, whether it's by the expression on your face that demonstrates that you're looking at the person and taking an interest in what they're saying. And it's really important that you explore the issue and ask questions to find out more detail. If they use acronyms and things that you've never heard of, it's really important that you ask those questions to find out more. If you're not sure, restate the information and then ask them to confirm that you're understanding it correctly. And at the very end of anything, you want to be able to summarize what you heard to confirm with the speaker is what they said. Because often that's where communication breaks down. I was so busy thinking about what am I going to say next that I didn't hear some very important things that happened in the meeting. After the meeting. So before the end of the call or meeting, you need to reconfirm those next steps and actions and future and the dates of any future meetings or the plans for future meetings. So that's what you need to walk out of the meeting with. So one of the tricks can be that they write an actual report. It was a school team meeting, and this is the summary of what we're all going to do, and they may provide that to you. But if not, you need to be making a summary of your own of what you heard at that meeting. And an effective strategy is to send a thank you note for the meeting with a summary of what you expect is going to happen. So that puts in writing to them what you heard and what your expectations are. Important to complete all the tasks that were identified for your action, whether it's providing information, making appointments, or going to see something. And then you need to be monitoring changes in your child or the school program and track their progress for future meetings. So they've decided that they're going to take a new tack in terms of how they're going to deal with this situation for the next eight weeks. So you need to find out from your child whether they're happier, whether they're feeling like they're being more successful. You need to be looking at their work to see if there's any change. So you're monitoring their progress so that when you go back into that next meeting, it's not just the teacher saying what they saw in the as a result of the changes, but you've also been seeing it from your side, from the child's perspective. And you'll soon know whether something's successful or not. What do parents really need to know? We've talked about knowing your child. So one of the things that I recommend is diagnosis. If there is a diagnosis, what does it mean and how will it impact your child at school? And this can be of a special concern where it's going to be something that impacts their learning, or that's going to require some special equipment or some different approaches to instruction. So if you have the opportunity when you're talking to somebody who's making the diagnosis, really delve down in terms of what it means and how it will impact your child at school. You need to be able to share at any time their skills or interests that will help the student learn. What are their strengths? What are they bringing into the classroom that's going to support their success? You also, of course, need to know about their needs or challenges and things that need to be talked about and addressed, but in a solution-focused approach. And you also need to know about the special education process. We're throwing out IPRC and IEP. Some of you have been through it, some of you haven't. So what's the process at my school? And where can I find information about it? So one of the best sources of information about special education is actually from the school board on their website. They will have information in their special education plan, which will cover off what the process is for an IEP, what are the contents for an IEP, who will be involved. So there'll be a lot of information there, and there's also a lot of information on the Ministry of Education website. So IPRC and IEP. Hannah's talked a little bit. So one of the things is to really be clear in your mind that these are different elements, and they're both very important, but they serve different purposes. So as Hannah said, the IPRC is a process legislated under the Education Act in Regulation 18198. And you can go on the board website or the ministry website and get a copy of that and look at all the things that it says. It tries to cover off the process, and those people that were involved in preparing it were really looking at the parent role. So it makes sure that the parent is consulted and involved in the process, where they're involved. By law, they are required to notify you of an IPRC. The school can't make you go to an IPRC. All they can do is notify and encourage you to attend. But before this regulation, there were processes that were happening where parents weren't involved. So it was a good step forward in terms of requiring parent involvement at different steps. So the IPRC determines whether a student is exceptional and their placement. And as Hannah said, there's 5 categories of exceptionality and 6 different placements. But there are, under exceptionalities, there are different categories. So for example, intellectual was one of the ones listed, and that goes from both ends of the spectrum. Students that are gifted, students that have a mild intellectual disability, or students that have a developmental disability. So it's the full range of intellectual. And so when you're talking about exceptionalities, they may be talking about something specific under one of those 5 headings. When the student is identified as exceptional, the school board has a legal responsibility under the regulation to meet the student needs and develop an IEP. So this is an individual education plan. So it is a working document that is used to describe the student's strengths and needs and the program that will be used to support the student each term. So the IPRC is typically done once a year and can be waived if you think there is no need to go because there's no changes in your child's exceptionality or placement that year. IEP is much more the working document. This is where you actually put down the strategies that are going to be used to help to teach your child, to assess your child. This is where you're going to document any accommodations that are going to be provided. And that may change over the 13 years at school. So it's a working document, currently required to be reviewed every term in elementary, although I expect this will become formalized as only twice a year. And then the secondary, it is typically tied to each semester. So at each of those points, there is a review of the IEP to look at what's working and what's not. So the parent role in the IPRC. As Hannah said, you may initiate the IPRC with a written request to the principal. I'm not keen on that. It is your right to do it, and there are circumstances where you must do it in terms of the interest of your child. But I think it's much better that you are working with the school and that it's sort of a joint decision that this child is exceptional and would benefit from going through the IPRC committee and getting it the child formally identified as exceptional, and that the child has in placement. One of the things is that I see there are more protections in the IPRC for the child because it's by law the board is required to meet those student needs. An IEP is a working document and it changes and it doesn't have the same authority. So the IPRC is really, really important that you attend. So I've said you can initiate it, but it's much better if it's a joint decision between you and the school. Once there's a decision on an IPRC, you must be invited. I know there was one question there about saying, they're saying they're going to have an IPRC, but it's not till January. So when you submitted that written request, they then had to get back to you that they're going to have it and give you a rough date, but it's not required to be in that period of 15 days. They only have to acknowledge your letter and say there is a plan for an IPRC. So in terms of the timing, you want it as soon as possible, but sometimes things get in the way and it is delayed. But once you've had one, you must have an annual review. And again, I fully encourage parents to attend both the initial and all of the reviews. Again, it's part of being a partner with the school, that opportunity to talk about things that are happening. And there are lots of transition points in the child's school career where it might be very important to talk about placement. if they're changing schools to senior elementary, and definitely when they're changing to high school. And as they go through the high school years and you're starting to plan for their leaving school, those IPRCs can be really important in terms of talking about their placement, which may change over that period of time. The parent must be provided with the school board parent guide for the first IPRC. One of the problems with that is that you get given the document, you don't know what it is, you're overwhelmed, you just put it aside. But there is a copy of the parent guide on the school board website, and I recommend you to download it and have a copy with you, because it goes over some of your rights related to the IPRC and some of the special education processes. So they must give it to you, but you might have 14 years of IPRCs, and so you may never see it again. But I encourage parents to look for it themselves, to see what's in it, so that they are informed about the school board processes. You should attend and participate, as I've said. And I strongly recommend bringing a representative or additional person for support to the meeting. There's a number of things that representative can do. They can take notes. If you're very emotional or having difficulty with the meeting, they could act as your representative and speak for you. But most of all, what they're giving you is emotional support by being there at your side. And so they've helped you plan for it. And then afterwards, they'll help you talk about what happened at the meeting. So having an additional person can be really, really helpful. If you're happy with the decisions around the identification as exceptional and the placement, you can sign the committee statement of decision, affirming that you agree with it, and then they will go ahead with the placement. Usually there isn't a change of placement till the following September, but if there's no change of placement, your child stays where they are. You're just signing that you agree, this is the decision, and you agree with it. If you've agreed with it, you must be provided a copy of the IEP within 30 days of the IPRC decision or placement. Now, this 30 days is school days, so effectively it's 6 weeks. And so what we see happen is you have your IPRC or your IPRC review in May or June, and they make the decision as to what's going to happen, but they don't start developing the IEP until your child is in the new placement. So typically you get your IEP around Thanksgiving. They've been at school 6 weeks, and here's the document they've developed. To me, that's a terrible process, but that's typically what does happen. During that 30 days, you should have been part of the process and being consulted. And I'll talk about that a little bit further in terms of the IEP. But the important thing is that as a result of the IPRC, that your child is going to get an IEP. So then the next is dealing with concerns about the IPRC. Because it's part of a regulation and an annual review is required, you're going to do this more than once. If there's a decision about a placement, that even if you find it's not working, you actually have to wait 90 days or 3 months after an IPRC before considering a review of the IPRC decisions. That seems like a long time, but that's in fairness to the new placement, to give an opportunity for your child to see if they can thrive in that environment, and then before you raise discussions about an alternative placement. So if you have concerns about the identification, that is your child's exceptionality or placement, try and raise those concerns with the school staff prior to the IPRC review. Ideally, the IPRC is the culmination of meetings and discussions you've had with the board about your child's needs, that you'll all go in agreeing that this is what the exceptionality and placement is going to be, and then it's going to be very simple for you to sign at the end of the meeting. If you don't agree, then there's different solutions. But the more you can be planning ahead so that it becomes much more of what people would say is a rubber stamp. Oh, I know what it's going to be. I agree with it. We're just going to do it. We have it on record that it's been done. And so I think if you have a positive relationship, that can be really effective. If they went ahead with the IPRC and you disagree with the decision, it's really critical that you follow the timelines for requesting a second meeting or filing an appeal of the decision. I have to say in Ontario, there are not a lot of appeals on a regular basis. Most school boards are embarrassed if they have one, and if they have multiple, then they're very concerned. They are going to avoid having an appeal, so they're going to be very interested in having a second meeting with you to talk about your concerns, to see whether they can address them. They are motivated to find a solution, but you have the legal right to appeal. There are critical timelines. And one thing to know is if you don't file appeal, then the placement decision and the exceptionality decision of the committee stand. The fact that in the end you didn't sign it, the board can still go ahead with putting the student into the new placement. So it's very important that if you disagree, that you do have another meeting with them and or that you file an appeal. I'm sorry, I've lost my connection. All right. Can you see me, Hannah?
I can see you, Allison, but we
we
just
lost-
can't see your slides.
Okay, so let me pull them back up. No, I can't access my slides, so I'm going to stop my share.
Okay,
Are you able to pull them up, Melissa?
let me see. I think I have them. Just hold on 1 second.
Yeah, I've had an internet failure to my remote office. This is where I should have backed it up and put it onto my laptop.
How's that?
Yeah, thank you.
And are we right here?
That's the slide we were just talking about, yes.
Perfect. So you can just let me know, Allison, when to switch to the next slide.
Okay, do you want to go to full screen with the slideshow? Just in the middle, after animations is slideshow at the top. Home, there, slideshow, and then from current slide. Excellent, thank you very much. I'm really glad that you had a copy. So moving to the next slide. The IPRC decision. So the decision will state a description of the student's strengths and needs, whether the student is exceptional, and if so, the areas of exceptionality, and it will record the placement decision. It may have some recommendations regarding special education programs and services, but what we've found is that these are not always fully implemented. They do not seem to have the same weight as the placement or exceptionality decision, but they are recommendations. And because the board has signed this IPRC, they're agreeing that your student is exceptional and needs additional services. So it's very important that they pay attention to what the recommendations are. Often their recommendations are fairly limited because they're hard to enforce. And this is why the importance of the IEP. In the IEP, you really want to document what's going to be provided to your child. Often everything's good, you sign the decision at the meeting. Sometimes you can take it home and think about it before you sign it and send it back in. But as I said, not signing it doesn't mean that they're going to change it. If you want to have it changed, you have to ask for another meeting or file an appeal. Next slide. So if you disagree, you have 15 days after the receipt of the decision to request the IPRC hold a second meeting to discuss your concerns. If you really don't want to go that route and try and find a solution, within 30 days of the original meetings or 15 days of the second meeting, you must file a notice of appeal. As I said, if you do nothing, the decisions stand. So in terms of the appeal, moving to the next slide. The parent role in the appeal. So you may appeal the decision. You're appealing the decision of identification or of placement. Where I said that they may have put some recommendations for programming, that is not appealable. If you're going to have an appeal, it's going to be held at the school board level by a committee that will be brought together, and you will be responsible for selecting one of the members of the appeal board. The school board will appoint a second one, and the two of them will work together to identify somebody to chair the meeting. You may bring materials or individuals that can provide additional information relevant to the appeal. So if you're not happy with their exceptionality, you might want to bring somebody that can actually speak to their diagnostic information or psychological assessments or some additional information that the IPRC did not have in the first place. You can also bring a support person, and I strongly recommend that in all circumstances. If you get a decision of the appeal board They may support the school board, or they may recommend that the placement be changed. Both you or the school board can appeal it to the next level, which is a special education tribunal. By the time you get to that state, you may want to consider having a lawyer there to represent your interests, because it's a much more formal process. Although the trend is to hold mediations with the board and the family to try and get solutions. So where it used to be very, very formalized, they're now really using the mediation model at the tribunal. Go to the next slide. The IEP. It's now 6:45. I've got probably another half a dozen slides on the IEP. Melissa, do you want me to keep going for 5 more minutes, or should we stop at this point?
Let's maybe, would you be able to do a speed round of your slides, Allison? Okay. And then we can get to the Q&A.
They are going to get a copy afterwards, right?
Yes, yes, they will.
Yeah. So the important thing on this slide is that although an IEP must be developed if you've been through the IPRC, an IEP may be developed for a student who has not had an IPRC. Across the province, we know that more than half of the children that are receiving special education programs and services have not been through the IPRC process. In some cases, this is a school board philosophy where every child is in a regular classroom and they do not use the IPRC process. For others, it's a trend where they're saying, well, if we get an IEP and we can support the child's needs, there's no need for an IPRC. I'm a strong advocate for the IPRC because I think that that's your legal protection. That's your agreement with the board that your child is exceptional and they have to support their needs. So the IEP helps teachers and other staff understand your child's needs and provides a plan of how they can help the student to learn. So it's a written plan, a living working document, and it should change every semester. So that if they're working on certain things in the curriculum this semester, if they've been successful, then those goals should change in the next semester. If they haven't, then you may be looking at what additional strategies should be used to help the student achieve the goals we set in their IEP. And as I said earlier, it is reviewed regularly each term throughout their career and each semester at high school. Next slide. So the contents of an IEP, they start with tests and assessment results, strengths and needs. They include accommodations required to access the curriculum. And that includes instructional accommodations, how the teacher is going to teach, assessment accommodations as to how the student is going to be assessed. So for example, I'll share my story. My daughter did not develop very strong written skills. So she often gave her reports orally. Now, she had a developmental disability, so even that is a challenge. And so one of the successful strategies was that they had a Q&A. So somebody that she was comfortable with would ask her questions, and she would then provide the answer with which would meet the goal of the teacher of being able to, for her to be able to demonstrate that she'd learned something. So this, the accommodations of instruction or assessment are really important. And for students with physical disabilities, environmental accommodations can be very critical in terms of where they are, whether they need a special desk, whether they need other equipment. For a child that's deaf, it might be FM equipment in the classroom. In the modified or alternative program, that includes specific goals or learning expectations and information on the instruction and assessment methods. Now, this is only if the instruction and assessment is different to what they are providing to the rest of the class or different to the accommodations they're being provided. It should also list the special education and related services. So if they're going to have an educational assistant or another paraprofessional supporting them, that should be documented. If they're going to be seeing the speech language pathologist, that should be documented. And if they have a healthcare plan with an outside agency, that is sometimes attached to the IEP. And most importantly, there has to be a transition plan. Historically, the focus of transition plans was out of school. So you started them when you were 14 at high school. But we know now that many children struggle with transitions right from the start. So for some students, they have to have a transition plan for every change of activity. For some, it's bigger transitions, like when a different teacher comes in for part of the day or they go to another classroom. For many, it's that transition, the big transitions between grades or between schools. So there's lots of different reasons and elements that can be captured in a transition plan. Carry on.
Yeah, let's go to the Q&A, Allison.
Yeah,
since
that's
it's
fine.
7:50.
Yeah,
And
so
we'll make sure
more slides are going to focus on the parent role in the IEP, but you can all look at them afterwards. That information is available to you. So I knew that I had more slides than I needed, and I'm sorry about that, but I was really wanted to share as much information as possible. And as Melissa said, I have been, I've done many workshops for Holland Clearview, and I'm happy to come again if you identify topics that you want me to go into in more depth.
Mm-hmm. And so, Allison, just wondering if you can take a look at the Q&A right now. There's about 12 open questions. I think Hannah and I tried to address the bulk of other questions. So if you are able to answer any of those open questions first, that would be great. And we can also continue typing our answers to other questions too.
Okay, so the one that I pulled up that I'm going to answer is from M. Oh, they're all from M. No, well, this is orange M. Not sure if appealing will change the school board taking the EA away. So first of all, you don't have a right to appeal the supports, the programs and services that are provided to your child. The right of appeal only applies to the decision about whether your child is exceptional and where they are placed. Those are the only two things that you can actually appeal. So in this case, it sounds like the student has had an EA for a long time, and now they're looking at taking the EA away, saying it's an issue of cost, and they want the parents to consider putting the child into a congregated class. And that's what I take when it is meant by life skills. So in terms of this question, you can't appeal the EA being taken away. You need to work with the school to sort of talk about what the EA has been able to do in the past with the student, how the EA has supported success. And you then need to be talking and going up the chain of command, even above the principal if necessary, to talk about why having your student in the regular class with an EA is going to provide a more effective education than putting them into a different class. So it's all about making the case. What is it the EA provides? If they're supporting them, especially if they're supporting them in learning activities, you really want to document them. If there's other health and safety concerns, that can also make a very strong case as to why the child should have an EA. But the EA is a separate issue to the placement of the child into a life skills class. And certainly you would have to have an IPRC before your child would go into a congregated class. And then if you had an IPRC, you have the opportunity to appeal. So I gave a lot of information there, and I hope that was helpful. So the next one is hiring an additional EA considered an undue hardship. I think under Human Rights Code, if you could provide evidence in terms of the need for that EA, for that to be with that child all the time, I don't think the board could claim undue hardship for the additional EA. But the reality is that they are required to balance their budget, and they have to make decisions about allocations of EAs. They have a hierarchy of needs that determine where EAs are placed. The best efforts are made to make sure that all of the health and safety issues related to a child are covered off by EAs, and then they allocate obviously based on the school needs, and then down to the actual classroom level. And so it may be that a shared EA can actually meet all the child's needs. So it's about having meetings and talking and exploring the different ways your child could be supported, because you certainly can't appeal the EA. You could make a human rights claim, but again, what is your evidence that this child needs an adult with them 100% of the time? All right, the next one itself is on suctioning of his track several times an hour. The school has asked us to consider a different class as it is disruptive to the other kids when his nurse does it. Are they able to ask us to change classes? He is in grade 1. At this point, he may need to stay at home because of his immune system and the risks of the pandemic. But if he's at school and he needs to have that health procedure in the class several times an hour, yes, I can see that some might consider that disruptive. But it's also about attitude. So really talking to the kids in terms of helping them to understand what's going on, what's happening, so that they recognize the need for it. There may be a way to be positioned within the classroom. I don't think it's an automatic case that they can take you to a different class. I think you need to have some discussions with them as to what the different class placement will provide. And I think you, in terms of a placement decision, if you had an IPRC, would have the right to appeal their decision if they want to put the child in anything other than a regular classroom. If you want the child in the regular classroom with the nurse, I think it can be done, but I think you're going to have to really look at how it can be done that is in the best interest both of your child and the other children in the room. Next question. What if the special ed class your child's been placed in doesn't seem to be a good fit due to safety issues? My child is struck or pinched a few times a week by a couple of violent and aggressive students. Although the school added an extra EA, it doesn't seem to have helped. So I think you need to go in and have discussions with the teacher in terms of a health and safety plan for your child. So it probably needs some discussion around what are the circumstances in which the violence occurs, the striking or pinching. Is it done when the teacher's aware of it? Is it something that's going on where the teacher can't see? So you need to sort of explore the whole issue and then develop some plans as to how your child can be safe in the classroom. And if the child can't be safe, then you need to open those discussions about, is there another placement we can look at for my student? The next one I see is my son is on the spectrum, and no, I can't quite see it. I saw the question and then I've lost it.
Sorry, I think that was a question dealing with exclusions, right? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, so I quickly sent you a link to the Arch Disability Center there. They have a great toolkit on what your rights are when they're starting to ask you to leave your kid at home. You know, there are exclusions that they sometimes ask you to leave your kid at home or pick your kid up before a school day is done, or just not bring your kid. And so there are rights relating to that. If you're, you know, in terms of what is proper when they ask you that, what you can do.
Yeah. Yeah, it is a very bad practice when the principal informally asks you. It would be better if there was a process where it was clearly documented that your child was asked to be sent home for a particular reason, and there needs to be a follow-up meeting immediately in terms of what are the supports that are not in place, what else needs to be in place, what were the reasons why you felt that the staff could not manage the child for that period of time. And there needs to be also some discussion about the child in terms of what other strategies can be done to support the child. And is there some things that we know would be help to resolve the issue or calm the child down that we could provide? Often when there is incidents where a child is asked to be home, it's because of inadequate supports. The child may find that the only way that they can demonstrate the fact that they're unhappy and it's not working is by aggressive or other kinds of behavior. And then you get asked to take them home. But really, you have to have some real in-depth discussions as to what is driving the child to not be behaving in the classroom. What are the issues in terms of support? What else can be done to enable the child to be at school? The focus whenever a child is sent home, whether it's informal or through a suspension, always has to be on how quickly can we get the child back to school and what additional supports can we need to make sure the student is successful.